Like your books kind of took a turn with deep work. And that was when I discovered you. And of course, that was kind of like your, in a mainstream way, kind of your breakout. With that and the books in between up to now, where does kind of, I found that books, when they're in a series, kind of keep going deeper into an argument. What part of the argument are you in, and what kind of compelled you to do A World Without Email, even though, as you mentioned in the book, you covered some of these topics before in your previous books?
Well, so deep work was focusing on the value of focus. So I was noting that we seem to be underestimating the value of giving something unbroken attention. We're doing less and less of that. It's probably worth doing more. And I got into how you could be better at focusing and make time for it. But I was pretty casual in that book about why we're having such a hard time with focus. Yeah, we're doing email too much, and so we should probably, once you realize focus is important, you can kind of do less of that. The immediate response that I got was, I don't think you realize the degree to which the need to constantly be checking email and constantly be on Slack has become embedded in everything about modern business. And so immediately after Deep Work came out, I began working on this book. My earliest interviews go back to 2016, where I set out first to answer the question of, well, why do we work this way we currently work? And that thread just kept unraveling, and the answers that emerged were epic to a degree that I didn't expect when I first got it started, where it turns out that we've fallen into this way of working relatively arbitrarily. It wasn't intentional or planned. The damage of this way of working, once I actually talked to the researchers and really got into the data, was much worse than I had imagined. And then this notion of it's inevitably going to change something new.
I didn't hear you, Dad.
I thought that was a really compelling story about where we are in the world of work today and where the world of work is going to go. So I think Deep Work kind of picked open that scab. And once that world was open, I realized that there's an epic story about how our economy evolved and its impact on people and where we're going to go.
I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. My 4-year-old can't hear you.
I'm talking to you.
I know.
I'm not.
Sweetheart, it's school time. It's not time for PJ Masks. Can you close the door?
Well, the PJ Mask is
I know, but
coded.
it's not school. Thank you, baby. I don't know if you have kids. I believe
I have a 2-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 8-year-old.
Oh, okay, I want to say I seem to remember that you said you had kids, and yeah, it's like they ignored me all weekend or all morning. I mean, until I got on the phone with you. It's like, hey, Daddy, what's going on? Why are you talking to yourself?
Yeah,
so,
this is my life.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I only have 2, so hats off to you for doing that. And that actually ties into something else I wanted to ask about. Is I have a 4 and a 7-year-old, and I'm the primary caretaker. My entrepreneurship career, when I did my first 2 startups, started when my first son was 4 months old. And so it was very much a trial by fire. I didn't know what the hell I was doing with either one of them. It sounds like you've become a parent over again while you're writing this book. Did that change how you handled things at home? Because I imagine it'd have some type of effect. I know when I've researched books and I've said in the business world and entrepreneurship world, this is happening, I can't help but kind of look at my own structure at home and be like, oh, wait, hold on. Maybe there's things I can apply. Were there any particular insights that you got with working on this book, even though it's about email, but about your own systems at home?
Yeah, well, also probably just the experience of having kids, but also I have multiple jobs.
Right.
That probably influenced the work I was doing on this book. Actually, could probably reverse it, because my setup is one in which I don't have the luxury of just applying busyness to my professional life. Like, well, I'll just crush it. Like, I'll just be in emails on Slack all day and just add more hours at it and just do lots of stuff. And I have to be incredibly careful about what I do and why I'm doing it and how I do it to try to make everything fit. So I think because of that, as I got deeper into this topic of, well, what would replace this hyperactive hive mind? If we wanted to get away of a world where everything was just being worked out with back and forth messaging, when I was seeing the emerging answer was, you identify the actual processes that make up your working life and you begin to optimize. I had a real affinity for that because I was forced into doing something like that anyway. So I really understood what that meant. where you have to move past let's just rock and roll, let's figure things out, we'll just be on email, just kind of crush it. And you have to get past that and say, no, we have to be way more thoughtful about what work do we do and how do we do the work in a way that's going to make it all fit. So for people, which is basically a lot of people right now, because their kids are at home, schools are hybrid, schools are canceled, I think a lot of people are getting a crash course in the value of becoming almost radically rigid about some of the processes that make up your working life.
No, that makes perfect sense. To get a little bit more philosophical with it, in reading the book, it felt like it came down, at least to me, as far as separating the what from the how. So, what are we going to do? We're going to do this. Okay. Right. And so it's like, we got that clear. And then you have the how part where it's like, okay, well, how you do it, that really depends on your systems. I have a new book out where I talk about resources and systems. And so it resonated a lot with me. That seems like that wasn't always the case, though. And I love the insight that you have with Pullman and the more mainstream example with Ford and with the digging and so forth, like really good examples. I loved it. And it seems like, though, that the knowledge economy, if you want to call it that, has kind of conflated the what and the how. Do you think that falls into that, I forget the term, but that idea of having autonomy? Do you think that's really the source of us having a hard time separating the what and the how? Because it seems like that we're more independent, but it also seems to be a level of micromanaging that's happening too.
Yeah, the autonomy explains a lot of the current situation. So this Peter Drucker influence focus on autonomy, don't tell a knowledge worker how to actually do their work,
right,
is a big part of the reason, I think, about why this hyperactive hive mind mode of collaborating, even though it's so intuitively unproductive and psychologically devastating because we all feel that and we all hate it. The reason it's persisted is in an environment of autonomy where everyone's just left to figure out on their own how they do their own work. You are going to get stuck with the lowest common denominator, the thing that's most convenient, the thing that's most flexible, the thing that's easiest. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been a little bit slow to evolve past this sort of first early attempt we had. So I think autonomy plays a big role. If you go back and read early Drucker, if you read Drucker in the late 1950s, if you read Drucker in the early 1960s, he's really grappling with autonomy a lot, because it's hard for us to think about now in the 21st century how radical any sort of autonomy would have sounded to someone in the 1950s or 1960s, because all of our economic growth had been built on this industrial sector that had been revolutionized by the opposite, the descaling, the breaking everything down to the steps and optimizing the steps and dumbing down the worker and this rigid sort of assembly line mindset. So Drucker felt like he had a lot of work to do to try to explain to people that's not going to work in an office for someone who's writing ad copy. And then he was right about that. But of course, as I argue in the book, it went too far. And we did not make the crucial distinction between having full autonomy in how you execute your work, but having a lot more thoughtful top-down thinking about how you organize the stuff that has to be executed. And I think it's in making that nuance that that's the foundation for basically any large change on this issue.
Yeah, and I think there's a great subtext in the book, because, I focus on technology, and there's a great subtext in the book almost paralleling, the Drucker statements, like you said, the early Drucker, with kind of that Disney World of Tomorrow energy that was hip before I was born, in the 50s, where it's like everything's going to be automated. And I remember seeing advertising shortly before I was born in the 70s where it said, get this new computer, or now the whole computer's here, then, your work production will go up 100%, or times 100, like 100x or whatever. And it seems like that didn't really happen, and we just got busier. That was something else I wanted to talk about. I loved your idea of the protocol principle, and I interpret it as short-term pain for long-term strategy and productivity. And I was like, that makes perfect sense, because the systems in some cases are going to be uncomfortable at first until you get used to them. And of course, having people have a say in it, particularly if you're in a leadership role, is like crucial to moving forward. As far as you talking about the locus of power. What I found interesting is that over the past year, which I'm assuming, knowing the publishing industry, you probably had the book pretty much done when all hell broke loose over the past year. And many of the people that I coach, the folks I connect with, similar to yourself, and being on the front lines and chatting with folks all the time, a lot of folks are in survival mode now. So a lot of the context of the book, it's like, okay, you need to pull back a little bit, look at the strategies that you're doing. But then we kind of see people digging in and saying, I'm just trying to get through the month, the year, the week, the day, so they're not really thinking long term. Have you found with the conversations you've had with different organizations, different individuals, with your roles, do you find that the issue of not following that protocol principle, do you find it exaggerated in the pandemic? Or do you feel like it's just revealing the stuff that was already there?
I think most aspects of the hyperactive hive mind got more hyperactive during the pandemic.
Okay.
So when we separated from the physical offices, which turn out to have, there's all of these informal, implicit productivity boosters that we get from being in the same room and being able to see people and grab people and chat with people and see their faces. When we lost all of that, that began to inject more into the hyperactive hive mind. Also, it created a lot of uncertainty, right? So now suddenly there's a lot more things that had to be figured out. And in that crush, there just wasn't time to do it thoughtfully. So we just put Zoom meetings on the schedule. So it got even more crazy. So I think in some sense, the shift to the pandemic, it made the pain points of the way we work even more painful. So in that way, it could be pushing people maybe to the brink where organizations and teams and even individuals are like, okay, something has to change. I've certainly seen that. In with my own audience during the pandemic. Like earlier in this fall, I released the planner, this time block planner, just to help individuals. It's a philosophy I have about how to be more structured about your time, especially when it's limited, like during the pandemic.
Right.
And we had like over 2,000 pre-orders for a planner.
Wow.
There's no pre-orders for planners, right? Like,
no, maybe for books, right? But not for planners. No.
Yeah, right. Because
congratulations.
What benefit? What benefit, right? But so I think there's a sign of a hunger, right? Like the pain point got acute enough that so it's pushing some people over. But at the same time, I write about this in the specialization principle chapter of the book. And I guess it's kind of prophetic. Yeah, I did write that, most of this before the pandemic, all of it actually. But it's kind of prophetic now. I noted that one of the problems of having too much to do, like too much on your plate, is that there's not enough margin to improve your processes, right? And so it's part of my argument for we need to reduce how much, we probably need to specialize more, have less on people's plates, because if you have too much stuff on your plate, you don't have the breathing room to actually figure out how to do those things well, which means you have to use them, attack them into hive mind, which makes you even less efficient. You have even less time. And I think that effect happened to a lot of organizations during the early pandemic in particular, because having to change the way Inc. publishes its magazine. We have to figure out how to do this remotely, multiply that by a dozen different issues. It was just too much work for people to have the breathing room. But I think by the time we got to the sort of second half of the pandemic and people got past the okay, we have to just figure out how to even run our business, right? A lot of acute problems we didn't have before, and they're finding a new equilibrium. They're still experiencing, when we're remote, the hyperactive hive mind is more hyperactive. Let's maybe look for a better option. So this was like the New Yorker piece I wrote this summer on remote work, which was basically, I just finished this book and then the pandemic happened. So this piece I wrote for the New Yorker about remote work over the summer was like me being able to get deep into these ideas with respect to the pandemic, right? Because I was like, the book was done before
rough timing.
And that was like the hopeful message of that article, was like, maybe once things settle down, we got to catch our breath, but we're still in this remote period where the hyperactive hive mind's extra hyperactive. This will be the push we need to start really getting serious about processes and starting the move on past the hive mind, like I preach in my book.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I respect your idea of it being a sharper pain point. And it'll be interesting because I know for a lot of folks, they feel like still that we're going to go back to the way it was once the offices officially open back up and whatever it takes to get us back. And there's kind of the understanding. I think you see that, and I definitely see that, where there will be a different type of world that we'll be entering back into, if you want to term it that way. One thing I was really curious about is I used to live in Silicon Valley. Like I said, I've done a couple startups. And the line that stopped me in my tracks, which I loved, was, I'm going to paraphrase it. You said, we still talk about innovation, but almost exclusively to what we create, not how we create it. And it literally stopped me in my tracks. I was like, wow, absolutely. And I was curious as far as with getting to the Drucker idea, as far as early Drucker idea, as far as the autonomy among workers. There's also a sense of ego there. Like whatever technology age, particularly those of us who are technologists, we feel like we understand so much more than the previous age. Could we just believe that we're above or beyond needing to change our systems? Like, are we looking at it like we understand things at such a level? Like, it's back to that, I think it's Epictetus who said that you can't teach a man what he believes he already knows. Do you think ego's part of that thing? Or do you think we're just moving so fast we're not paying attention?
I think Silicon Valley had that problem for a while. They didn't realize the effect to which this autonomy trap was really stifling true innovation. So they were looking at superficial workflow innovations, like is our office open or closed? Do we have ping pong tables?
Yes.
Or these type of things, right? Campus innovation, superficial innovation. But on the other hand, so what's interesting about Silicon Valley, they were really aware, and yet didn't extrapolate from this example. They were really aware by looking at their software developers that real innovation in workflows can make a difference, right? So the one sector of knowledge work that does not embrace the hive mind and is incredibly innovative is software development. For other reasons, it was the pressure of project schedules. They developed these agile methodologies like Scrum or Kanban that are very different than the hyperactive hive mind, and are actually like a great example of the type of process-based workflows that I preach, where there's a transparent system for keeping track of who is working on what. There's really clear thinking about how much any person should be working on at the same time, how people coordinate with each other, when do we talk, how do we talk, how do we get the information, sprint methodologies. So from a cognitive perspective, maybe we should just be working on one clearly identified thing at a time and should take this long. And it's beautiful, I think, the innovations that happened in software development. And yet for the rest of the Silicon Valley ecosystem, it didn't extrapolate. And so I think that's really interesting. I think part of what was going on out there is that they really embraced the computer metaphor for humans and work. And in the computer world, you have a computer processor. It's a circuitry run off of a regular scheduled clock. And there are these low-level commands that the processor executes. And it's completely agnostic, right, to what it's executing. It's just command, command, command. It's electrons to circuits. Everything takes the exact same clock cycle. And the whole game in building efficient systems is just making sure you keep the pipeline full. So that the processors always give it something to compute. So you want to get stuff to it faster. You want it to compute the things faster. And it's speed, right? Because the processor will just do it. So let's just get the clock going as fast as possible. And let's do pipeline and predictive pipelines to make sure that there's always things for it to be executed, that it's never idle. I think this reduce the friction, speed things up. This mentality affected the way they thought about humans collaborating. We got to get the friction out of the communication systems. We got to get the friction out of finding information. The human brain is a computer processor. We want to keep the pipeline full. So what we need to do is get faster communication, lower friction communication, speedier communication, get the networks faster, get the tools can show more messages, use AI to autocomplete your sentences. You can finish that email even faster. That's a computer metaphor. But it completely didn't take into account that the human brain is not a computer processor. And actually, it's very slow to shift context, and you can exhaust it for the entire day if it has to switch back and forth too many times. And there's only so many different types of things it can think about, and it needs food, and it has weird social dynamics. So even though it might be efficient from a computer's perspective to fill an inbox faster than you can keep up, so you always have something to process, the social aspect of the brain gets incredibly anxious because those all represent people that need you and you're ignoring them. And so I think there was that sense in Silicon Valley in the late 90s and early 2000s too, when they were building their tools.
Yes.
It's faster, faster, faster. If we can get information that people need to them faster and easier, the processor will be more efficient. And it completely disregarded the realities of human biology and psychology.
Yeah, I mean, I was there just over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago. And that's when Soylent came around and other types of products that were saying you don't even have to stop to eat anymore. you just have this liquid shake. It'll give you everything you need, like an Ensure. or like a, Infamil. But that's kind of,
Yep.
we kind of went to that extreme. So just to respect your time, actually, I have one other question for you. The other thing that hit me, aside from the innovation part, was the idea of digital sunset, which I never heard of that term. You mentioned it like once in there, where you're talking to, I believe it's Johnson from Optimize. And this idea of shutting off, which I got two little kids, you got kids, like shutting off is tough because we're already on all the time anyway. And what I'm curious about is tech to blame for the end of that job sunset? Like, getting the proverbial briefcase, coming home and then making or cooking dinner or whatever? Or do you think it ties to other business changes? Because it's easy to kind of say, okay, tech is the thing, and it's email and it's Slack, and obviously now it's literally on all night. I just joined Clubhouse and they were sending me notifications literally in the middle of the night. I had to turn them off. So do you think that tech is part of that issue, or the main part of that issue for the end of those sunsets that were naturally occurring in my parents' generation? Or do you think it ties to other business changes like productivity and other aspects?
I think it's the hyperactive hive mind. I think once you decide that the main way we organize all work is informal, unscheduled, back and forth messaging, you're always going to have that messaging going on. So first of all, that's part of the problem. So if that's how things just get worked out, now you're just constantly servicing these back and forth conversations. It generates way more asynchronous communication that you can easily keep up with. So now you have to service this at night and in the morning as well, even just to kind of keep up with all these conversations. And two, because you're spending so much time doing this back and forth during the day, you significantly reduce your ability to actually work on anything else with any sort of reasonable concentration during the day. So we had to move our work into the evening and move our work into the morning. We've somehow become used to this, but I'm just saying, looking at this objectively with a little bit of distance, it's absurd. It's like a Kafka play, right? Like this idea that we are now talking about work so much that we can't actually get any work done during the workday. Like it's something that you would imagine in like an absurdist theater,
right?
Like it would be some sort of absurdist commentary on, early mid-century Soviet bureaucration or something like that.
Right.
But it's the reality of a lot of knowledge work, right?
Sure.
And we just kind of take it for granted, like, oh, it's just we're busy, and it's like something I hear, for example, is in some of the critics in the circles I run, their reaction to this is like, yeah, we're working more in the morning, we're working more in the evening because we're being it's the screws are being turned to us, right? Like it's an exploitative relationship, like in a sort of classic,
like a Marxian type of way, right?
Like a Marxian type analysis. And those have really emerged recently, which I think is very interesting. That even in a moment where in most social criticism right now, the dominant mode is more postmodern, right? So it's more like postmodern critical theories. In the world of work, it seems downright old-fashioned. You have a lot of these sort of more classic Marxian type critiques of they're turning the screws because they can, right? The managerial class is exploiting to get more labor. I think it's actually more incompetent than that. I think this hyperactive hive mind took over for the various reasons I talked about, somewhat accidentally, and for the various reasons I talked about, it's not easy to dislodge. And one of the side effects of this hyperactive hive mind is that we get to this absurdist situation where it spirals out of control. But we just can't get our work done during the workday. Just feeding the hive mind takes up all of our hours. We're on Zoom or an email 8 hours a day. And so the work has to happen in the evening and the mornings. From the managerial's class perspective, if we could get rid of the hive mind and do this work during the day, like a lot more would get done. I mean, I'm starting to, this is being recognized now in Silicon Valley. This is a change I've seen for sure. But other places as well, because I do stuff with C-suite types. They realize this is terribly unproductive. They realize it's burning out their workers, it's creating dissatisfaction, people are leaving the workforce, they're shifting to part-time in ways that's not very effective for either party. They know this is a problem. It's just really hard to solve. And so, we're working all the time now, in part because we're so bad at working. And I wish it was a cleaner story of like, it's the cigar chopping factory owner is trying to exploit us 20% more. But I think it's a more desperate situation than that. We have, as an industry as a whole, we're working so ineffectively that the wheels aren't staying on the car, which is why I conclude this book saying, look, a world without email is coming, because what we're doing now is 100% unsustainable. And there's so many better options. And it's enough of a pain that it's not going to happen real easily, but we're feeling enough pain that I think we're going to be willing to take up that challenge pretty soon.
No, that makes sense, especially as, Slack recently got purchased and all these things. So it feels like we're kind of in a bubble of that asynchronous productivity machine. And so, yeah, I'm kind of like you. I'm curious to see what's next. And thank you for writing the book. Like, I think it could be something that people can read and see that there is a better way to do things. Yeah, good stuff. Well, listen, I could ask a whole bunch of other questions, but I want to respect your time. Cal, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Damon. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. You take care, okay? What was interesting is kind of leads to my second and last question, because I want to respect your time. One thing that we have in common, which I love that you emphasize, in fact, I think it was the only time in the book where you use capital letters, which as a purist, I'm usually against, but I agree with you. If you figure out what's going on and you know what's going on in your career, we're going to focus on career, isn't working, don't blow everything up.
Yeah.
Why do we do that? Now, you have a short chapter about that, but I'd love to hear it from you. Like, why is that impulse there? And even I have that impulse, even though I coach other people. Why do we do that?
Yeah. And it's funny, I literally start the book with a very brief personal note that implores people not to do that.
Right. You said at the very beginning and you say at the end.
Right. I'm like, you may discover something about yourself that will reveal something on a level that makes you feel this compulsion to just blow everything up and start over. Just don't do that. Like, it may be the right thing for some people way down the road as the last option, but not the first step in. And the reason I feel like some people feel that compulsion is because, especially in the context of something like your Sparketype, where it tends to be such an innate and strong impulse that once you've had it reflected back to you, right? And I don't like tell anybody, generally when people discover their Sparketype, whether it's through reading the book or, on a sort of like a more superficial level through the assessment, rarely do people come back to us and say, oh, this was a big surprise. What most people say to us is, wow, this was eerily accurate. It was so spot on. I feel seen and understood in a way that it's almost like you're in my head. And it rings so true to who somebody is that when you have sort of like a truth reflected to you that is so clear, and so you know it in your gut that it's right. And then you look out at the thing that you're doing in the world, whether it's your paid job or whether the main thing that you do is a role or a devotion, and you see that thing is actually really poorly aligned with this impulse for work that makes you come alive. There's a really strong compulsion in a lot of people to say, I cannot do this for a minute longer. And I completely acknowledge and honor and understand that impulse. I have had it myself many, many times. But along with that, we tend to we can get a little bit delusional at that moment too. And we can start to tell ourselves a story that says, if I blow this up, if I just walk away from this and start over completely and try and find something totally new and different that maybe will give me that feeling that I so yearn to have, it's not going to be super disruptive. It's not going to be such a huge deal. I'll figure out the next thing pretty quickly and step into it. And it'll be a little painful. And then we'll just keep on keeping on and I'll feel awesome.
keep on.
Right. And the truth is, for most people, if you're 21 years old and you do that, sure, maybe the stakes are low. There's not a lot riding on it. Nobody's looking to you for a sense of security or anything like that. And even if you have a value of, commitment or financial security and things like that, you're so young, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you've got a lot of financial responsibilities. You have values that say this is actually really important to me, and you want to model certain intentional behaviors to other people.
The model is interesting. That's a really good point as well.
Yeah.
The obvious version is parenting, but that's actually a really good point. If I can interrupt you for a second, that's an excellent observation. Because then you're representing your family, you're representing as a mentor, you're representing as a parent, whatever that you're representing as a as a son or a daughter or whatever, like you're representing in a certain way that I guess you don't have as much when you're younger. Yes. So
Yeah, so it's much harder to just completely say I'm blowing this up, because it's not just you that's affected by all of this. Like you're creating a level of disruption and pain and groundlessness and change, not just for you, but for potentially a lot of other people. And the stakes are very likely way higher at that point in your life than they would be. And the transition tends to take longer and have a lot more stumbling and experimentation than you think. So that next thing, it generally doesn't just magically appear. Sometimes it does, right? But I don't want to just assume that that's going to happen. I want to acknowledge that there's a process here. So in my mind, the more the approach that tends to work much better for people is to first actually look out, at this work that you're doing, say like, how well does this map with what I know about myself? And if it does, great. If some things are actually really well aligned and other things aren't, then go through a process of seeing how you can reimagine it so you can do a lot more of the stuff that aligns and a lot less of the stuff that doesn't, or maybe even look for even new things within the context of what you're doing to bring into it to give you what you need. And so you can very often get way closer by doing that process and not have to endure all this huge disruption of blowing things up and starting over. And then at the end of the day, maybe you get, like way closer with that, but you're still not there. And then you start to look at all the things that wrap around it, the hobbies, the passions, the activities, the roles, the devotions. Maybe they have nothing to do with getting paid money, but if you invest energy in them, they're going to give you this feeling. They become really powerful outlets for this impulse that you have. And the blend of all of that, it really gives you pretty much what you need, plus the economic stability of still having that main thing. That's okay. That's like decent. And maybe you get to that point and you're still like, I'm not quite where I need to be. I still want more of that feeling. And then at that point, you start to have that conversation about like, what would it look like if I did something really new, like an entirely different job or company or industry or something like that, or even retraining in a whole new field, and then you step into that from a place where you bring a very different emotional state to that exploration, because now you're stepping into it from a place of actually probably feeling pretty good. You're no longer stepping into it from a place of futility and victimhood, but saying, no, I've actually done some really powerful work to understand who I am and how I am. And I've built a lot to actually feel like things are actually okay now, but I just know that they could be a lot better. So you step into that exploration psychologically in a much more empowered and confident state. And people will respond to that in a radically different way when you bring yourself to the world that way. And then you also allow yourself a certain amount of grace and say, okay, so it's okay if this actually takes a bit of time. I'm going to start to just run experiments until I figure out what this next evolution looks like, so that I can be more confident when I'm stepping into it. And then I'll figure out what is the best way to step into it as seamlessly as I can. So there's a process that I think, is just much more intentional than just saying, okay, I feel this compulsion, it's real, and I'm just going to act on it. Sometimes a little bit of patience and forbearance goes a long way to really not just getting you where you want to go, but also receiving grace from those around you through the process.
Let's talk about the satisfaction spectrum. I absolutely loved it. I've never seen anything like that before. Process versus service. I'm a maven, so I'm all about process. I don't have to even make books. I just sit here and tinker all day and come up with these brilliant ideas and do all this stuff. But then the service side starts to take over for me, and it gets a little bit deeper. Can you talk very briefly about the process versus service and how we can kind of balance those things out? Because I know a lot of artists, I work with a lot of artists who just want to create, but they're not thinking about how they're going to impact the world, which is the subtitle of most of the books that I write. So it's like, you got to impact the world with it. Otherwise, you're just doing stuff. But then I know other folks who are willing to what I would call self-sacrifice. And they're like, I want to give so much to the world, but they haven't worked on the process yet. And I think you talk about that in a couple of the chapters where they haven't worked on themselves enough, so they don't have anything to talk about. So how do we strike that balance? And what would you suggest to people who are at either extreme end?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was literally just saying to somebody today that nobody has asked me about the satisfaction spectrum yet. You're literally the first person. um, and I
Thank you.
was
Great.
and I was actually really curious about it because I actually think it's so important.
Yeah.
And so what I noticed, so there are these 10 different sparketypes or impulses, right? And I describe them always in a particular order. In fact, they're in the book in a particular order. And the reason for that is that I realize they lie on a spectrum in terms of how a person with that impulse is fulfilled. And for some people, some of those impulses are very, very process oriented, meaning you could literally just drop into your process, lose yourself in that process, and feel completely at peace, alive, energized, like you're like on purpose and you have all the meaning that you want from just being able to do this thing. You feel like you're doing the thing you're here to do. On the other end of the spectrum, people are highly relational. You literally have to be in service of other people, other beings, other things, ecosystems, whatever it may be, in order for this impulse to find its way out. And we tend to never talk about it that way. And we tend to always say that, the only valid expression of purpose or meaning is when you're in service of others. And that causes a lot of problems for people whose sparketype lies on the process satisfied side of the spectrum, because you as a maven, you could latch onto a topic and literally just go deep into it, spend 13 hours a day immersed in learning everything. Like you want to become encyclopedic about it, and you are the happiest person in the world. You feel like you're doing exactly what you want to be doing. And if you could earn your living just doing that, it would be amazing. You would never stop. Now, the fact that you're learning something may equip you then to turn around and share it in a whole bunch of different ways that would be incredibly valuable to other people and have them pay you for it so you could sustain yourself. And that's awesome. Maybe that, and a lot of mavens actually tap their shadow sparketype, which may be more service focused, as funding engines for their maven impulse, which is really cool, but that's actually not why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And to say to a person who's so just utterly fulfilled by something which is very heavily process focused, that is not valid. To me, it creates a sense of shame. That is just, there's no reason that we need to do that. And what's interesting is that even though most people who lie on the more process heavy side of the spectrum, and that would be like mavens, makers, scientists, essentialists, right. They're really happy just losing themselves in the process. Inevitably, they end up creating things or solving things or figuring things out or offering things or teaming with people who then unlock these quote service side of the things, that their work ends up actually having a huge amount of value to other people. And they love that. And it's really nourishing to them. It feels really good. And very often that's how they get paid to do the thing. But secretly it's not why they do it. Or at least it's not the whole reason. It's like a nice part of it, but it's not the central reason that they do it. And similarly, like you were saying, if you have that wiring and you want to earn a living and try and make that your central thing, at some point you have to find a way to take the thing that you're doing and have it be valued by other people. So it has to serve them in some way. So if it's the thing where you actually want to center that as the thing that sustains you, that becomes a livelihood, full or part-time, it has to enter the equation in some way, shape, or form. So understanding these balances, I think it's like a fascinating dynamic to me.
Yeah. I mean, I was like, why is this at the end of the book?
Well, it's funny because it's in the appendix at the end. And the reason is we actually couldn't figure out where to put it in the book that made sense. It would have actually made a lot of sense to put it in the very beginning of the book, but it's also kind of a nerdy point that's a little bit esoteric, even though it's really important. And we're like, right. So for Maven,
who are you talking to? Right.
Right. Exactly.
Like, this is the good stuff.
So, right. For nerdy esoteric Mavens like you, like, it's awesome. But
I'm in the appendices all day. Yeah.
Right. But what we realized, for most other people, it was a little too into the weeds, a little too soon. So we ended up putting it there. And yeah, I'm actually probably going to call it out a little bit because I don't want it to get lost, because I actually think it's a really important concept.
Yeah. And again, as a fellow fellow coach and person who feels like they at least try to serve other people and help them shine. That resonated with me so much because that balance you're talking about of process versus service, I feel like that's like the internal question. Because again, if you're just serving, at least in my opinion, if you're just serving, you have to work on something that's actually going to serve people. So eventually you're going to have to go to the process part. It reminds me a lot of, if you're familiar with Natalie Nixon's work.
No,
with,
no.
Yeah, she has a book called The Creative Leap. And it's somewhere around here. So I have somewhere on my shelf. But she talks about going between wonder and rigor. And so wonder is when you're probably similar to a process where you're thinking about things and it's like, what if we had flying cars? And what if we didn't need drivers anymore? They would just drive down the street. That's wonder. Rigor is, oh, okay, so how will we get the license for these cars? And how would it actually work? And how do the pieces work? And so it's this constant juggle. And it seems to be a parallel with some of my work, Natalie's work, your work, where it's not enough to just create, because sometimes making it about service can actually sharpen the process, right? And I would think vice versa as well.
Yeah, I mean, like there's an interesting example that I love that sort of like contrast of wonder and rigor, by the way. It's so cool. Thank you so much for introducing her work to me. I'm going to check it out. Yeah, like I was thinking of pairings of I was talking to somebody the other day whose primary was essentialist, which is all about creating order from chaos, systems, clarity, which makes me want to cry. That's my anti-spark.
Is that your shadow? Is that your anti-spark?
Right. And her shadow was sage, which is all about awakening insight, illuminating, teaching. And I said to her, I was like, I said, this is really interesting. I said, do you feel that for you, the process of teaching is not just like of service to other people and helps you like generate income and sustain yourself, but do you lean on it in no small part? Because that process actually gives you so much more intel to take back into the process of distillation and creating order, systems, and processes, and be able to do that at a much higher level. And she's like, oh, 100%. She said that teaching side, it gives her so much of the raw material that then goes back and informs the very process heavy essentialist side. So I completely agree. There's a feedback mechanism.